And so this is a session, Designing ePortfolio Curriculum, Possible Models, Possible Opportunities, and it has a tie-in to a book, soon to be a major release movie, ePortfolio as Curriculum, edited by Kathleen Yancey. And I'm not quite sure in what order these are going to go, maybe on the slide, huh? So I'd like to introduce Susan Kahn, Jennifer Stonaker, Helen, Chen, and Kathleen Yancey.
Thank you, David. Hi again. Can everyone see my head, at least? Okay, so I thought that Kathy was going to set a bit of context, but I will plunge right in nonetheless. So I am going to be talking today about an English capstone seminar and the ePortfolio curriculum that we've designed for that seminar. And as a little bit of context, I'm Susan Kahn, by the way, from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, IUPUI. And I've directed the ePortfolio initiative at IUPUI for the last 12 years or so. I'm also a member of the English department, and I've team taught the capstone course in the English major for many years, along with my now retired partner team teacher, Karen Johnson. I'm going to talk today about a reflection assignment we developed the last time that we taught the course that seems to work very well in supporting metacognitive identity development, which I would contend is an essential element of an ePortfolio curriculum, particularly in a capstone experience. And it will become clear as I go along what I mean by metacognitive identity development. As many of you know, I'm sure capstones can take a variety of forms, but in our department, students take a capstone course. The literature on capstones tells us that the most effective capstone experiences help students achieve several developmental tasks, as you see on the slide there. Serving as a culminating experience, helping students to synthesize their learning and reflect on what their learning experiences add up to, hopefully something meaningful, achieve a sense of closure, accomplishment, and agency, especially important for English majors in this day and age, and prepare to make a transition to the next phase of their lives, whatever it is they may be doing. Identity development is also intrinsic to all of the processes that I've outlined on the slide. As students synthesize, integrate, and prepare for transition, they're, as part of those processes, figuring out who they are now as new graduates, emerging professionals, family and community members, and so on. And to support these processes, we have students develop a capstone portfolio. Noted ePortfolio scholar Kathleen Yancey says in the book that's going to be coming out soon that capstones are particularly hospitable sites for ePortfolios and an ePortfolio curriculum because a capstone is understood as an opportunity for synthesis and culmination and as a site of transition, while ePortfolios are understood as a unique vehicle for facilitating synthesis, culmination, and transition. So thank you for validating our choice, Kathy. But we have had two perennial problems in the English capstone. We have, over the years, arrived at two major reflection assignments in the course. They also do a senior project in their particular concentration area. The two reflections have been an experiential reflection based on some experience or experiences that they've had, and an integrative reflection in which we ask them to think quite explicitly about how their learning experiences relate to one another. We really struggled with the experiential reflection, particularly with designing questions and prompts that stimulate meaningful reflections rather than description or narrative without reflection, or platitudes about the value of the liberal arts. And we've also struggled with getting students to think intentionally about the composition of their e-portfolios as unified, coherent narratives of identity, rather than just collections of work samples or just another assignment. And the quote that I've got there comes from the language of the e-portfolio assignment that we give them early in the semester. We ask them to structure their e-portfolio to show the audience who you are and what your educational and other experiences add up to. And we tell them that repeatedly, but we learned over the years that it doesn't always happen when you tell students to think about something. They don't always do it. So to address those problems or those dilemmas, we decided to try something new for the experiential reflection based on a reading that we'd been using in the course for several years by the anthropologist Mary Catherine Bateson, an essay called Composing a Life Story. In that essay, Bateson argues that any set of life events can be interpreted and told in multiple ways. The stories we tell ourselves and others about ourselves, in other words, are subjective constructions based on choices that we make about how we interpret our experiences. Those stories, to a large extent, construct and constitute our sense of our own identity. And Bateson says that you can play with, compose multiple versions of a life or of a set of experiences within a life. And she gives some examples in the essay from her own life and then from her father's career. She argues then essentially for a metacognitive understanding of the construction of self. She says that understanding the construction of self in this way confers various advantages. And she says that we all have stories about our lives that we use as lenses for interpreting experiences as it comes along, but we don't always recognize that we make choices as we compose these stories. So we had been having students read this essay for a few years, and we had noticed in the online discussion forums that we had that it seemed to be a pretty powerful reading for them. And here is a typical comment from one student. I've always thought my story goes one way and it can't be altered. It's interesting to think that I can be in complete control over my life story, how it's perceived, and what I decide it will mean for me. It's actually kind of liberating. It turns out that Bateson's understanding of the construction of self can be very empowering to students. So Karen and I decided to try an experiential reflection based on Bateson's essay. And those of you who arrived early got copies of the reflection assignment. If you were one of the later arrivals, you probably did not get it, but if you're interested, please talk to me. I'd be happy to email you, and I will be here for the duration of the conference. So what we asked students to do was to create 2 short versions of their life story, or 2 brief perspectives on their life story, or their educational story. Then we asked them to reread their stories and write a reflection addressing one or more of a series of questions that we posed. We asked them then to conclude the reflection by telling us which story their e-portfolio would focus on and how its elements would convey the story to their audience. So we asked them to do some explicit planning for their e-portfolio in which they actually wrote something down about how they were going to construct it. We also purposely separated the narrative from the reflection in order to discourage a narrative substituting for a reflection. So these are some of the reflection questions that we used. Most of them are about the relationships between the two stories. In all of our reflection assignments, and also in this one, we asked students to do 2 drafts. They do the first draft, they do peer reviews, they get several peers reviewing their reflection, and they also get feedback from us, the instructors. In this case, because some students struggled with the assignment, we also met with them. There were students who couldn't come up with a second story or wrote 2 stories, but then couldn't think of how to begin the reflection. And in many cases, the second draft was quite different from the first. For this particular assignment, and we were surprised by how powerful some students found the assignment. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. And this is Spencer. Spencer started as a computer science major, a professional major that he thought would lead to a good job after college, but found that he hated his computer science courses. He didn't do well in them. And he was enjoying some film studies courses he was taking in the English department. Film studies is one of the concentrations in the department. And so he decided to major in film studies instead of computer science. And approaching graduation, he was torn between his sense of failure for not sticking with computer science, a major that he thought would guarantee him a good job right out of college, and I think some of that came from his parents. And the sense of excitement and liberation he felt when he decided to switch his major to film studies, which he felt had given him the opportunity to enjoy college and develop intellectually and personally. So he wrote 2 stories reflecting those 2 points of view. One story where he really was a failure for having switched out of computer science, and another story in which this was an experience that had been extremely valuable and developmental for him. And majoring in film studies had really helped him to grow in a variety of ways. And in his reflection, he says that in reality, he hadn't resolved the conflict, but that he had found doing the reflection valuable. He says, previously, I'd only thought of my life as one continuous story, and I'd never examined it in different, unrelated ways. I feel that interpreting my own story in as many ways as possible is the first step to learning more about myself in order to discover what I'd like to do with the rest of my life. Here's another student, Hannah. Hannah was a double major in English and French, and she wrote 2 stories about her academic interests, one about her lifelong interest in writing and literature, and another about her love of foreign language and travel. And she says in her reflection that her portfolio is going to really integrate both of them. She says, my fields of study truly are linked, and I wanted to demonstrate that theme, showing how what I'm learning in one area strengthens the other and has led me to the career that I'm now pursuing. My e-portfolio shows the convergence of my interests. It embodies the harmony of my studies, connected by my deep love of language in its varying forms. So the focuses of the e-portfolio curriculum in this instance are metacognition, that is, recognizing identity as a metacognitive creation, a constructivist approach to knowledge in which we understand knowledge as socially and individually constructed, and integrative learning. We asked students to think integratively by finding 2 ways to tell their life stories, discussing the relationships between those 2 perspectives, and then applying an integrative approach to the development of their e-portfolio. Focusing on these aspects of the e-portfolio curriculum benefits students, I believe, based on the outcomes of this assignment in these ways. It helps them develop an enhanced ability to engage in intentional self-authorship. It leads to greater self-awareness, an increased sense of agency, self-efficacy, and resilience, greater metacognitive fluency, in the words of that other famous ePortfolio researcher, Tracy Penny Wright, and finally, and importantly, better, more intentionally composed ePortfolios. We actually did get the best set of ePortfolios that we had ever gotten after having students do this assignment. So I am hoping to further refine this assignment in the future. I hope that some of you will try it yourselves, adapt it to your own context, and let me know what happens. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Jennifer Stonaker, and I'm going to be presenting today with Helen Chen about our science communication program at Stanford, which is called the Notation in Science Communication. And the Notation is a fairly new program. It was started in 2013, and it's administered by the writing program at Stanford, which is the program in Writing and Rhetoric. The program in Writing and Rhetoric is an independent writing program. We teach all of the required freshman and sophomore writing and oral communication courses, and the Notation is a program that's more for upper division students who want to continue their work in communication. We have about 60 students in the program right now from a variety of different STEM disciplines, STEM majors, and in the 4 years that we've graduated students, we've graduated a total of about 50 students so far. And there's 3 main components to our program. We have coursework, advising, and then the ePortfolio. Students do coursework both in science communication and portfolio preparation, and they have courses that they take both within the writing program and also partnerships with the various science disciplines. And the same is true for advising. So students have advisors in the writing program and also from their STEM disciplines. But ultimately, the program, we sort of refer to it as a mini minor. It's not quite as intensive as a regular minor for students, and there's a little more flexibility in the program. But students create these ePortfolios at the end of the program. They're learning portfolios, so the students need to demonstrate that they've satisfied the learning objectives of the program. These ePortfolios are evaluated by a team of faculty, and then students can earn a designation on their transcript that indicates their advanced work in science communication. And so, given these 3 components, I'm going to focus mostly today on our ePortfolios. And the ePortfolio is really flexible. We don't use a template. The students are able to include different artifacts and examples of work that they want, but we do ask that they have sort of 4 main components, which I'm going to run through now. So first is a cover letter, and this is really just a framing document for the portfolio. Provides some information about who the student is, what they've learned while they've been in the program, and also provides that framework for viewing the rest of the portfolio. Then students have their artifacts, their examples of work. They typically have 6 to 12 artifacts in different combinations. They can be grouped, they can be in a linear arrangement, they can be in a variety of different genres and modes. And importantly for the activity that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, students get to choose what artifacts they include. And they don't have to only include work from the Notation coursework. They can include work from throughout their time at Stanford. They can include co-curricular activities, study abroad, volunteer work that they do, research that they do outside of class. And so it's really up to the students to decide what they include. Because of that, it's really important to have reflections, which contextualize the artifacts. Students also can provide additional reflections on grouping of artifacts or perhaps on their future goals and future directions. Because the students sort of have some free reign in creating their portfolios, we really see a lot of variety in what they include, and they really tailor it for their own personal experience. The last element, which is really key and what we've learned that we have to spend a lot of time on, is the design of the portfolio. So the goal here is to have the design really enhance the overall message about learning that the portfolio is presenting. And so students work really kind of exhaustively on site mapping, on visual rhetoric, making sure that everything they include in the portfolio is telling a cohesive story. So here's an example portfolio from one of our engineering students. And you can see she's chosen this really bold, Mondrian-inspired design, and it ties into her love of art and architecture. She's a civil engineer, she's really interested in architecture, and so it immediately kind of cues into who her persona is going to be in her portfolio. So this is her cover letter. As you scroll down the page, you get to this really excellent visual representation of the structure of her portfolio, and it's this 3-story building. And I think the best thing to do here to understand what she's trying to do is to read it in her own words. So this is what she says about this diagram. As a communicator of civil and structural engineering, I have practiced my skills both within and beyond the technical realm, for academic, professional, and public audiences. From technical details to abstract questions, I love to explore the balance between order and complexity in the engineering experience. I think of these layers of knowledge like stories in a building, from foundation details to top floor concepts. In the foundation, I communicate how to do engineering. On the ground floor, the immediate impacts of engineering on the human experience. And on the top floor, abstract questions about the social and cultural meaning of engineering itself. While I would like these categories to be as clear-cut as mathematical formulas, my interest and experience are not so easily divided. This tension between order and untidiness is both the subject of my work and embodied in the structure of my portfolio. So I chose this portfolio because I felt like the student was speaking really sophisticatedly about not just her work as a science communicator and as a scientist, but also about the process of constructing her portfolio, kind of acknowledging the messiness and that we're imposing this order on it. And so what I'm going to talk about next is our portfolio preparation courses and how we scaffold assignments, reflective assignments, to help students get to this point where they can have these kind of sophisticated discussions about their work. So our portfolio preparation courses really bookend a student's time in our program. So when they join the program, they take a 1-unit introductory course where we kind of outline what folio thinking is, give them an overview of the platform that we're using, and just introduce them to the concept of e-portfolios. In their senior year, they take a 2-unit course where they build their final capstone portfolios. And these courses have 3 main elements: systematic reflection, multimodal construction, and audience awareness. So by systematic reflection, I'm talking about the series of reflective exercises that we do with the students that really build and iterate off of each other to get them thinking metacognitively about their work, making connections between their different learning experiences, and really making meaning out of what they've done while they've been in the program. Multimodal construction, we learned the hard way that we have to have our students thinking both about the content in their portfolios and the design of their portfolios, and that they really work best when we do that concurrently. And so we use multimodal construction to really get students thinking about the different ways they can present information. And then lastly is audience awareness. So again, this program is housed in the writing program, the program in writing and rhetoric, and so we have our students thinking rhetorically about the way they're constructing information. What's their message? Who's their audience? And so we build into the curriculum lots of opportunities for them to work with peers, to work with their advisors, and to work with other stakeholders to help build these portfolios. So I'm going to focus on one of our exercises that we do fairly early on in the course, and the goal is to help students curate that selection of artifacts that they want to include in their final portfolio. So to begin, I have them read a quote just to provide a bit of framing for the exercise. So I'll read it. Oops. There we go. So start with the data, think about them, listen for the story they are trying to tell, and find that story. Don't just listen to your characters' loud proclamations, though. Listen also to their quiet, uncertain mutterings. What might that shoulder on the spectrum mean? If that non-significant treatment effect were real, what would that say about your system? Is that outlier a flag for something you hadn't thought about but may be important? Overinterpret your data widely and consider what they might mean at those furthest fringes. Explore the possibilities and develop the story expansively. Then take Occam's razor and slash away to find the simple core. Only by exploring the boundaries and limits of your data can you find the important story. So I love using this quote to frame They exercise because our students are mostly scientists and engineers. And I like this quote. It's taken from a textbook designed for scientists who are writing research papers. And so it really helps them tie together the process of science communication that they're learning about in their other courses with the process of building their portfolios. And so I like how those two overlap, and they can see the connections there. So they get this kind of framing, and they have to gather 20 artifacts, a lot of artifacts, as many as they can think of, from all different genres and modes and experiences that they've had at university. And they do this for homework, and they bring them to the next class period. And in the next class period, we have them represent their artifacts somehow on Post-it notes. So they might just write a title, they might draw a picture, again, kind of thinking about that multimodal construction, and then they put them in different combinations. We're really fortunate to have this great room with these huge whiteboard walls where they can really spread out, but you could easily do this with slips of paper on a desk. What's important is that they can make different combinations, and they can iterate through and see how these different combinations work. We give them some prompts to help kind of figure out what those different combinations may be. So we do chronology, like the order you created things. We talk about grouping by genre. And then we also kind of push their boundaries a little bit. We give them the 7 basic plot structures that you see in a lot of stories, and we encourage them to try to tell a story with one of these plots, so like Rags to Riches, or The Quest, or Overcoming the Monster, which are kind of fun ways to think about their learning experiences. So they take a photograph for each kind of combination they make, and they do a little reflecting on those, and we come back then the next class period, and we have them do a 1-sentence summary of one of their combinations. And the idea here is kind of going back to that quote. You've thought expansively, now we're trying to cut back to the simple core. And so this is Hannah's 1-sentence summary, where she's really kind of cueing in on some of the different themes that she's going to see in her final portfolio. These get refined through the course of working with peers and her advisors, but we're starting to see her identity emerge, both as an engineer, but also as an engineer who's situated within society. Again, thinking multimodally, we have them create a visual metaphor from this 1-sentence summary, which I don't have a picture of, unfortunately, but she basically drew her 3-story building. And so from this really kind of early point, she was starting to see groupings of artifacts, what groupings were important, and how they helped her tell the story she was trying to tell about what she had learned about science communication. And so, this is just one example. We have other students who come to kind of different groupings and different identities. We have lots of scholar athletes who kind of integrate that into their identity. We have lots of students who are pulling in their co-curricular work or their cultural backgrounds. We had a student who used her cultural background as an entryway into her interest in global health. And so we see these students really crafting these complex identities that represent really kind of complex natures of who they are, both as scientists and as communicators. So just to wrap it all up, and then I'm going to turn it over to Helen. Basically what we're doing in our program is we have our portfolio curriculum, which is really promoting metacognitive thinking. And through the creation of e-portfolios of these representations of what they've learned, we're really helping students craft these unique disciplinary identities that they can then take with them once they leave our program. And that's what Helen's going to talk about. Sure.
Okay. So we hear the words notation in science communication. The notation in this regard is really like it's a certificate, and so it's not again, as Jennifer mentioned, it's not a degree program. But how will students describe their participation in this program on a LinkedIn profile or in a job interview? And so to simply say I received this notation in science communication, it may not necessarily have that meaning when we look externally. This program was approved by the Faculty Senate, and so therefore, on the representation of this program, the actual certificate that students are awarded when they complete, it does carry the Stanford seal, and it actually also includes, this is a paper certificate, but we also have a digital representation as well. And this is actually work that was developed with our registrar, and something that I sort of worked with the program on. And so to give you a better sense of what that might look like, on the digital representation of this notation, there's an actual ID number. And from that ID, then you can, someone could immediately verify and validate that it was the student that was awarded this notation by entering it into this registrar hosted website. From there, and I think this is the unique innovation, is a validation page that actually includes a description of the program, as well as program learning outcomes and the individual learning outcomes of the courses. At the same time, there's actually a link to the portfolio itself, which has actually been archived in our Stanford Digital Repository in the library, so that it is a permanent URL and something that will persist in perpetuity until and so on. So as long as Stanford's around. But I think what this highlights actually is an opportunity to think about a closer connection between the record, and in this case the official record of the university, the transcript, as well with the actual evidence of the work. And so the partnership with the library, I think, is an example of that. Certainly the discussions and the partnership with the registrar is another example, an illustration of how this can happen, as well as our partnership with our ePortfolio provider, which allowed us to export the portfolio out of the platform, import it into the digital repository, the permanent URL being connected, and then being able to then link to that from the academic transcript. So, but when you think about, again, what the exciting possibilities are with respect to really trying to be more explicit and transparent about what is this program, what was the experience of the student. The student is trying to explain this to someone who's not familiar with it, to be able to have the learning outcomes, and most importantly, have the evidence of the student work. So with that, I just want to end here with actually a link to the Notation and Science Communication Program website. Our colleague Janae Druckmann-Cohn has posted actually a gallery of student portfolios that have been created in this program. So please feel free to browse, and of course, please feel free to talk with Jennifer or myself should you have any questions. Thank you very much.
If you came in late and didn't pick up handouts, please do. One is a handout for my remarks, and the other is a flyer. The reason I want the flyer is that if you're interested in the book, it gets you a 20% discount. So if they're here now, they'll be here afterwards. And my happy task is to talk about, actually to follow up, I think you'll see the through line, with other ways of thinking about design, identity, and story. And I'll say, just as an opening gambit, that one of the reasons that I began thinking about ePortfolio curricula, which can take place in ePortfolio courses of the kind that Jenny and Helen just described, that curricula, I think, also can happen inside other kinds of modules or courses, which was the capstone circumstances that Susan described. So as I understand the curricula, which would basically be a set of outcomes geared to portfolio creation specifically, set of readings, writings, activities, and so forth that are all oriented in that direction, that curricula can take place in any number of settings. I'll also say, as a final comment there, that one of the reasons that I started thinking about this was that I began to put into dialogue what it is we think students need to do to create very strong portfolios, and the absence of support we provide for students to create such portfolios. So if the portfolios don't look the way we want them to, a very good question is, why don't they? And the answer on many campuses seemed to be that students were asked to engage in the activity, but were not supported in the activity. So that's something of a genesis. So as you can see from this slide, I'm particularly interested in, not unlike my colleagues who just spoke, in portfolio design. both as a motive and moment for identity development. And what I'll do here is focus specifically on arrangement and different kinds of arrangements and how they produce different kinds of identities. My argument here is basically a rhetorical argument that what you arrange is who you invent. So arrangement actually is fundamental. It's not inadvertent. And the second point of my conversation today, or talk, is really focused on visual design, again, as a way of expressing identity. And I've got several student examples, and that's basically how I'm going to narrativize this particular talk. We have a lot of standard arrangements in e-portfolios. They're very commonplace. You can see before you. Narratives would be one, assignments, outcomes, courses and modules, program progression. What's interesting to me, however, and again, there are a couple of people here who know something about rhetoric who are in the audience. There's a very famous rhetorician called Kenneth Burke, who is something like the 20th century version of Aristotle, profoundly influential. And he talks about a way of seeing, as wonderful as is also a way of not seeing. And that's, in some ways, an argument for the multiple arrangements that you just saw Jenny and Helen talk about. That if you can gather work and combine it and reassemble it in many ways, it enables you to see things that you're not able to see otherwise. The other point I'll make here that I think is very interesting, that we haven't attended to as fully as we might, is that anytime we arrange something, we necessarily divide items from each other, which is a good thing to do. It's the function of categorization. It helps us in analysis. But what's also interesting about e-portfolios is that we're very interested in using those for connection. So there's a thing here, apparently, about dividing things, but also then about reconnecting them. And I think you'll see those as well. I'm going to point out, again, per Jenny and Helen's presentation, that multiple arrangements do function as something of a heuristic or a translation device. And just looking at this programmatically, I'll point out that one natural way of organizing work in the academy is through a transcript. In the US context, that's a transcript of courses. But even with our Career Center at Florida State, which is where I work, students are asked to take that transcript of courses and to take their co-curriculars and think about them through these other lenses like communication, creativity, critical thinking, leadership, and so on, because the argument is that in thinking about what they've done in a transcript way through this alternative set of lenses, they will see themselves as different people. And there is a line of research that has come out of that Career Center suggesting that in fact is the case. I'll also point out, I like to look at campuses that are doing very smart work I think is smart, and one of them is St. Olaf in the States in Minnesota. And they're very keen on connections and on links. And all I've pasted here is something from their webpage, but you can see that the set of questions that students are asked to think about in that particular model includes what connections students are making, the kinds of connections that they're making, and you can see highlighted in yellow that there are various kinds, from intellectual and social to emotional. What do students say about their connections, and why are these particular connections important? Again, connection as a way of fostering identity. And here what I want to do then is begin turning to some student examples. This is a student that I worked with when I was still at Clemson University, which is in South Carolina in the States. Josh was an engineering major and a creative writing minor. So he used to talk about using both sides of his brain. When he worked on developing a comprehensive portfolio, as you can see, he moved from the transcript representation of his learning to a visual design that divides his work into inside school and outside school. So the blue boxes that are before you are courses in creative writing. The red are courses in engineering. The green is out of school. And then you can see that he's drawing connections between them. That's basically, it seems to me, a set of mechanisms that help you create e-portfolios. But the other thing that's interesting about this is what he says. And you can see before you that he says the most important thing from his point of view about portfolios is organization, that the goal is to get your site to work together. The content you use for schoolwork should complement what takes place outside of school and vice versa. Then the second point he makes here has to do with the way we thought about his gathering his set of materials. And I had asked him to think of those materials as a kind of stock. And my reference to stock was thinking of stock as the kind of thing that you use to make chicken soup. So stock being something that's very rich materially that you can use for something else. And you can see in his quote that basically he did me one better. When he says at the end, it's not so much that you gather stock, it's that in this process you take stock. And I think that's basically a pretty good way of thinking about portfolios. Another example comes from a student, Christina, who was at Florida State, a graduate of the editing, writing, and media major that we instituted about 9 years ago or so. And she's less interested in dividing between in-school and outside school. What she wants to do is think about the central parts of her major, which from her point of view are writing. And that is the title of the major. It is in editing, writing, and media. But the second item for her that's so important is design. And so that's the way she decides to organize her portfolio. And so when you get to the writing perspective, for instance, she has inside school and outside school all put together because that's the arrangement that she's decided best represents her identity. So she has, in fact, a press release there that was a book press release from a major publisher in New York that's sitting next to the kind of coursework that she did. So she makes a completely different kind of division than Josh. And yet one other way to think, I mean there are many, but just a sampling, is to think about arrangement as working both visually and verbally. This is a student named Amanda who is in a course I taught in the fall, a graduate course that's called Digital Revolution and Convergence Culture. So its purpose is to focus on how writing, reading, and learning have changed through the advent of different kinds of technologies. And you can see in her model that she's got a kind of standard tab across the top that basically represents the coursework artifacts, for example, outside artifacts. But then the other thing she does here, because there are multiple points of entry, which is another thing that arrangement can provide, is use medium as a kind of entry. So this is the first entry there is a index card that she filled out the first night of class. That's her Twitter feed. She's a very active Twitter user. That's a video that she made. And the last is pointing to a monument that was important to her when she was living in Japan. She was a teacher in Japan for 2 years. So you can see that, again, her identity is represented here both visually and verbally, and we can enter her site through using these different media. It's also the case, however, that the visual all by itself is going to have something to do with identity. So again, much like my colleagues, let me tell a couple of stories. This is, again, as you'll remember, this is Josh's schema for how he's going to develop his portfolio. And what I was hoping he would do, much as Helen and Jenny have discussed, is identify some kind of a visual for a metaphor that would help to provide some kind of coherence. And I had believed the news that was across the land that had said that students of Josh's generation thought visually. This was, I hasten to add, wrong. When I said to Josh, so now at this moment in our portfolio creation, I would like you to come up with a visual metaphor. So please sort of just think visually as you do. And he sort of looked at me and said, Dr. Yancey, what are you talking about? I said, okay, we'll go back to square one. So going back to square one meant that we thought a lot about visuals, about visual metaphors, about how they might work. And then I got an email very late at night. He was a late owl, as it turned out. And he said, Dr. Yancey, synthesizer. And I said, good to know. So it turns out a synthesizer is, in fact, the metaphor that he used. And the reason he identified a synthesizer was twofold. First, he understood the portfolio as a vehicle for synthesis. So it was a kind of meta piece. It spoke to the synthetic quality of the portfolio. But equally important, possibly more important, it turns out that as much as I thought I knew Josh, I didn't know him as well as I thought I did. He's an amateur musician. So as an amateur musician, the synthesizer had a kind of personal meaning for him. And in point of fact, that is, in fact, how he developed his portfolio. So you can see here a couple of screenshots of his developing the portfolio over time. And basically, this is what his portfolio looked like, with an image of a synthesizer developing each page. Another example comes from a graduate student, a woman named Heather, who finished our program 2 years ago. She now is in a tenure line position. And the point I want to make here is that visual development is disciplinarily specific, ordinarily, and also that it is developmental. And in this case, this is a portfolio that Heather created in a course that I teach. Again, it was the Digital Revolution course several years ago. And the bird you see up there may be perfectly lovely, but it has nothing to do with anything. And when I asked Heather, why the bird, she said, I like them, and then showed me her tattoo. Okay, good to know. You like them? I'm happy. I will say, however, that as purposes and audiences and student development changes, so do their portfolios. This is the portfolio that Heather used to get a job, and it's a much more professional portfolio, and as far as I know, there are no birds hidden on it, but you should feel free to look for yourself. The last point I'll make here has to do with asking students to think about bringing arrangement and the visual together in new ways of putting different moments in their portfolio together. I'm back to Amanda's here. And what's interesting here is that on the left-hand side is the artifact that she has repurposed for the portfolio. So she took a Word document and repurposed it for the sake of the portfolio. And on the right-hand side, she's got 3 questions that I borrowed from Christina McDonald at Virginia Military Institute in the States. Three questions that work very well. I could talk about those. And you can see the first 2 before you. The first is, what is the artifact? The second is, what did you learn in creating the artifact? And the third is, what's next in following up on that learning? And what's interesting about those questions is that they're all about learning, and students select the artifact. And what I liked about this particular arrangement is that I can look at the artifact and I can look at the reflection simultaneously. And that's a really wonderful way of reading, and it's an arrangement I've shared with a lot of students, and they have used it to good effect. I'll also point out that when Amanda moved beyond the instructions I had given her and was creating other pages, she used basically the same strategy as you can see before you. All of which is my way of saying that in thinking in terms of connections, arrangement, the visual, and the reflection are fundamental to the enterprise, and I think we're just beginning now to think about what they look like. Last but not least, everyone should have a flyer, and if you don't, there are more below. We have a little time for Q&A, and we would welcome both. Thank you. Questions? Compliments? Praise? Oh, thank you. Okay, we're done. Thank you. Please.
Just an observation, and I agree with the remarks that reinforce the interactivity of design and content. You can't separate the two. But Jenny, for you, it's a question of clarification. You use the term visual rhetoric. Can you clarify what that means and what it looks like in the process?
Sure. I think it kind of goes back maybe to Kathy's example student with the bird, right? So we have a lot of students when they initially kind of pull images into their portfolio, they might be pulling in things they like, but they're not thinking about their audiences. So ultimately, these portfolios are archived in perpetuity in the Stanford website, and so we want them to think about that long-term use. And so making sure that the images, the colors that they select for their portfolio are all kind of building to the overall message that they're trying to convey. Mm-hmm.
I'm making fun. Yeah, please.
So these portfolio courses are culminating to capstone. So I'm wondering, has it had a trickle-down effect on the assessments in the courses that led to the capstone? That makes sense? Has it changed the assessments that are done in the courses prior to this capstone?
That's a great question. We have a capstone. Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I mean, which of us were you asking, all of us, or
Any of you?
some of us, or?
Go for it.
Well, I don't have a great answer, because I don't think that it has in the English department. I think it could, and I think it should, but that has not happened at this point. We're just not as sophisticated in our thinking about this as the Department of Florida State is.
I would say we came at it another way, actually. Can you hear me? Yeah. We created the editing, writing, and media major. which is not a rhetoric and comp program major. It's actually a shared endeavor between rhetoric and comp and literature primarily. Some creative writing faculty play a role too, but it's mostly literature and creative writing. It is unlike most humanities majors in that it's highly scaffolded. There are 3 gateway courses, one in rhetoric, one in writing and editing in print and online that we call Weibo, I'm going to come back to that one, and one in history of text and technologies, which is both a historical and theoretical look at the relationship between technologies and text over time. Then students have a set of optional courses, modules in language for many people. At the senior level, they have a required internship, and they have an optional capstone. So that's the structure of the major. When we created, interestingly, when we created WIPO, and I was as you might imagine, I was a very active participant in the creation of the major. And the WIPO class actually came from, the antecedent for it was a course I created at Clemson that was a course to help students work in our studio for student communication. And so I adapted it for our purposes at Florida State. And that course has several outcomes, as you might imagine, and it requires that all students create a portfolio. And also, the content of the course is very oriented to this kind of activity, so it works really well. And the other thing I'll say, that course is chiefly taught by doctoral students in rhetoric and comp, and not all of them, but many of them, when they teach this course, assign a portfolio that is oriented to professional audiences and purposes, even when students don't know what that professional opportunity will be. So that's pretty interesting. When we initiated the major, the students for the internship had to do a portfolio, but we didn't have faculty with enough skill to make it an electronic portfolio, so it was print, and we went to electronic 2 years ago. And I'm just now beginning a research project looking at those portfolios and what students say they learn in them. So it does sometimes, it can be the expectation is that a capstone requires X, Y, and Z, and so it does have, to your point, a kind of trickle effect, but it can also work the other way. One of the reasons that the faculty finally felt comfortable letting the students do electronic portfolio for the internship was that the students had the skill set. The students were ahead of the faculty in that regard, and that's what the students wanted to do because that's what makes sense to them. And most of them actually have continued repurposing the WIPO portfolio that they created in the junior year for their activities after college, which include everything from going to law school, some of them are now lawyers, to practicing as professional communicators. We have one who's basically a tour guide and a love boat, so all of the above.
I love the examples that you guys have shown with student work. One of the things that I'd ask is, and I'm going to ask the scaling question that you're asking.
This is Paul. He always asks the questions you don't want. Ask away. No, they're good questions.
One of the things I'd be excited about, great examples, but I didn't see any of the rubrics that you may have used for scoring. And I'm curious about the rows and the columns within the rubrics for some of the showcase work that you provided.
Yeah, we actually just revamped our rubric. So initially it was just a holistic, pretty basic rubric, because again, we didn't have any examples. We made it, but we had this flexibility in the program for the students, and so our rubric was a little bit vague, which worked out about as well as you might expect, in that the faculty who were evaluating it just basically did whatever they want. They didn't really look at the rubric. There wasn't enough context there. So we've got a new sort of rubric with rows and columns, and you might have noticed, so students can pass the program. They can also pass with distinction. So if they do really well, they can get kind of an honors. There's a revise and resubmit option. So that's sort of like one category where you're not quite there, but we'll give you another couple weeks to make some changes. And then there's an outright, just like no pass. So those are our columns. And then our rows, it's basically the cover letter, the artifacts, the reflections, the design, and then there's sort of like a holistic, like the overall message about learning, how well you've met the learning objectives. I feel like I'm maybe, oh, and then there's one that's like mechanics and style, because a lot of times our faculty would get really nitpicky about typos, and so we had to have a category where we weighted that so that they could kind of say that without tanking a student's overall portfolio. But I'm happy to share, and I'm happy to share with anyone, the rubric that we've developed, because it really is miles above the one we had before, and it seemed to work pretty well. We just used it for the first time this year, and we seem to have pretty good results with it. So.
I'd say two things. One is that in looking at rubrics for portfolios that are located in these kinds of contexts, that is contexts where students get abundant support to create the portfolio. So creating the portfolio is part of what they do. The rubrics look very different than they do otherwise. They look very different. One distinctive feature of those rubrics is that, and actually much as Jenny just observed, students are asked both to assure that individual pieces of work in the portfolio are done well, and that the portfolio itself is done well. Okay, and that's different. I mean, that's dividing those two, and they have to work together. But doing the portfolio itself well and not having the individual pieces look as they should is a Pyrrhic victory, and the reverse like also. The other thing I'll say about that is that in that context, it does depend on where the student's working. So the first chapter in this book is actually authored by 3 graduate students. It is a first-year composition course, and those students are very keen on fair use. So one of their criteria is, did the students use fair use correctly? Did the students provide sufficient attribution, et cetera, et cetera? So that's very different than, for instance, the model in the next chapter, which is from a community college, where the real interest there is in students' use of and repurposing of prior knowledge. So what's interesting to me when you start looking at this landscape is that the criteria that people are creating are very different than what we've been looking at before. And I think that's really exciting. And that's the second point I would make.
Well, I will just say that we did not have a rubric for the life stories reflection. We weren't really sure before we gave the assignment what a good life stories reflection would look like. But I will have a couple of rubrics in my session tomorrow with Stephen Hundley for assessing portfolios holistically. One that was developed on our campus for the freshman seminar, and one that was developed at an unknown, unattributed place that I found on the web. But I think they're both good starting points for the kinds of things we've been talking about today: integrated reflection, appropriate use of visual design that aligns with the other themes of the portfolio, and so forth. So come tomorrow and you'll see.
So I think we have time for one more question. Jeannie?
Yeah, I was wondering, I love that those e-portfolios are archived, like it reminds me of dissertations,
It's the same system that archives dissertations, yeah.
It's a great, respectful kind of thing. I'm wondering if you have partners, any kind of, because communicating science, like, wow, like that is such a cool thing. So are there partners on the other side that of students' Stanford experience that are going to pick up that e-portfolio or use it or leverage it or turn it out to the world, are there,
Yeah, that's a good question. And I feel like maybe one thing that we don't do quite as well is make that connection with some of those partners that might be beyond the university for our students. There's another program at Stanford, which is the Haas Center, which does a lot of outreach with various community partners. And given sort of the success of our notation program, they also now have a notation. And so those are students who are doing community engaged courses or community engaged projects, and then they make a small portfolio, or maybe they just do a reflection. I think they just do a reflection. But then that information is sort of a way for them to process that experience and kind of give back to those partners as well. For our students, a lot of them, they do kind of revamp their portfolios when they share them out with other places. We really are doing learning portfolios where some of the examples of work that they might provide are places where they learned something, and it's not necessarily a showcase of their best work. And so they often will tweak them before they send them out to kind of the wider public. But it's important then in that case that in their portfolios for our program that their reflections really contextualize why they're including that artifact so that people understand, like, this is my first year essay and I really learned a lot about, arrangement or about style or whatever, so that it doesn't just come off as this is something I'm, really proud of and it's an example of my best work.
You guys might just start a little journal or something.
Well, we've joked about having a portfolio of portfolios to publicize them outside, but we haven't quite gotten there yet.
I think our time is up. Thank you very much. We loved your questions, and thanks for coming.